Yippee. Romans 9. This is a tricky one. In fact, a lot of people think Romans 9 might be the trickiest. 9, 10, 11 are supposed to be the most difficult. I'll be tackling 9 and trying to mine some nuggets from chapter 11 as well. And Dr. Reed, I'm hoping, is going to cover chapter 10. Week after. Okay, this is building on chapter 8 then. Remember, we spoke a lot about free will. And this is developing that concept of free will or bondage to the will once again. Paul is getting back into this theme. So, first off, it may flatter you to think that you chose Christ. But this chapter is pretty firm in its insistence that you did not. You had nothing to do with it. And that's pretty humbling. Now, Paul develops this. He says, and actually John Piper was pretty clear in this as well. John Piper did his doctoral thesis on this chapter. And he really had a really good book out. It's in the church library. You read that. It's really well done. And no one has been able to refute Piper on this. People have tried very poorly. Okay, Piper asserts the same thing as I'm asserting today. Okay. There's also another philosopher named William Lane Craig. He's one of the more prominent Christian theologian philosophers who is actually denying the idea of free will. He is one of the foremost Christian philosophers. There's also Cornelius Plantinga, but Craig is more prominent right now. Now, what Craig actually says, he says that what happened is that God looked down those corridors of time and he foresaw that you would be a good lover, and so he elected you. Well, Craig says that he manipulated all the events in time to ensure that your election was sure. Sounds pretty good, huh? But, however, this is minimizing the omnipotence of God, the all-powerful aspect of God. Okay, because if God is truly omnipotent, all-powerful, he can also manipulate time. He can micromanage time as well. And it has been shown in Scripture that he does that, even to the extent of maybe extending a day by 24 hours. We find that in Joshua 10 where he extended a day, and I think we can take that literally as well, that he actually extended a day by 24 hours, that he manipulates time as well. But however, Craig believes that God just chooses the era which is most beneficial for his purposes, and that he just chooses the type of world in that particular era which would give him the maximum glory. And that all sounds really nice. God chooses a world in which the most people would be saved. Remember, we discussed last week, he's not that concerned with a whole bunch of people. He's concerned with holy people. But God does not save people directly. It's an indirect thing, okay? And that God does not interfere with people's choices. A wonderful thing of choice, since he is a consummate gentleman, right? That's nice, but it's silly. Some people would say, okay, well, God is so omnipotent that he could transcend time. He doesn't have to play with time. He doesn't have to play with clocks like people in Arizona don't have to play with their clocks. They don't have to adjust it for Eastern Daylight Saving Time or anything like that. Well, they refuse to, actually. He doesn't have to play with clocks, but I think it's been shown that he does play with clocks, too. So, this, I believe, is a false idea. And there's a strange thing is that William Lane Craig, however, he concedes to R.C. Sproul, who's another wonderful theologian. He says, yeah, I agree with Sproul that God controls every single molecule, but I reject that God will control the metaphysics of love. Craig does not think that love will be controlled by God, but that man is completely in control of his own love. Okay? And that's what defines Craig as something called an Arminian, a follower of the theology of Jacobus Arminius. That's a Latinized version of his name. His name may have been Jacob from Van Armen. He's another Dutchman, another wooden-headed Dutchman. Remember, we spoke about another wooden-headed Dutchman last week? What was his name? You remember? Yes.
Erasmus?
Erasmus, yes. And the racerhead, Erasmus. But here we have another Dutchman, Jacob van Armen. Probably he was from the region of Armen, which is a wonderful fruit-growing belt in Holland. But his name was Latinized, called Jacobus Arminius. So anyone who follows this concept is called an Arminian. And basically, Christianity is divided between two camps. You are either an Arminian or a Calvinist. Arminian or a sovereigntist. You believe in God controls everything, or you believe that man is in control of some things. Right? Now, but is this what this chapter 9 suggests? Is it? Does it suggest, as Craig would think, that God actually foresaw that Jacob looked down the corridors of time and saw that Jacob would love him and that Esau would not? Did he foresee that Jacob was elect and Esau was not elect? Is that what happened there? Well, there's no indication of that in this chapter. You cannot translate it that way. John Piper would not translate it that way. Very few people would translate it that way. And there's other reasons why you cannot translate it that way. You look further on down in this chapter, you go down to verse 25, and God gives a reason. He says, rather, I will call him beloved who was not my beloved. Does that mean he was seeing that he would be beloved at one point in time? No. God merely says, I will call him beloved who was not my beloved. And actually we see in this chapter that not that he was beloved when he was born, but we can also look back and we can see that he was not even beloved when he was consummated. Not even at that point. Okay? That God even looked prior to that. Jacob will be beloved. The older will serve the younger Jacob. Okay? That's pretty clear in this chapter. It's quite a reversal of what we would like to think. Now, there's also another excellent theologian, Michael Brown, not Raymond Brown of Catholic fame, who would say that here we have God providing a prevenient grace, okay, so that his elect will love him. That his elect will be provided an extra measure of grace in order to love him. That God is quite partial that way, After all, he was quite partial to the chosen people, the Jews, throughout all of history, and will continue to be. And in a sense, that's true. God certainly provided extra revelation to the Jews. Very much so. But he also invoked considerably more wrath upon the Jews as well. And that can hardly be seen as that gracious. And they didn't consider it all that gracious either. So having this extra grace wasn't all that beneficial for them. And we see that in this chapter as well, where Paul draws from the Old Testament. There's an Old Testament that was written about 200 BC. The Hebrew was translated into the Greek, and Paul draws on that Greek translation and says, this is what the Greek translation says. He says, though the number of sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. Well, how gracious is that, right? Only a remnant. He's drawing on Deuteronomy back then. Good Old Testament stuff. So, it doesn't look like that grace or that revelation was all that effective to the chosen people. I should have worn my chosen hat today. What a wonderful hat. So, was it because these sons of Israel were so numerous? Deuteronomy says, no. God replies, no. It's not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. Okay. What's the reason they were elected then? Why? Why were they elected? Puzzling, isn't it? Why? Well, God gives a reason. The reason God gives is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. Because he loves me? What kind of reason is that? Well, it's the greatest reason. Why? You should be delighted in it. You should be delighted in this reason because you are not responsible for your election. Why should I be delighted in that? Well, because you couldn't possibly lose your election that way either. Because it's not up to you. You didn't choose to be elected. And because God is keeping his oath. Well, that's pretty solid stuff. And in that way, God is actually saving you. He is saving his elect. He didn't merely make you savable that you might choose to be saved. He's actually saved you. He chose you. What a wonderful comfort. What a wonderful comfort. And this comfort is in something called unconditional election. What does that mean, unconditional election? There is no reason why you were elected. None whatsoever. There was no conditions involved. And you should be overjoyed by that. So what kind of love is this? It's unconditional love. This is one of the main points of Calvinism, unconditional love. There's an acronym, TULIP. The U stands for unconditional election. Okay. Now, we get to the tricky part of this chapter that Paul goes on at length about, where people would challenge him and say, well, that's not fair. If I'm not responsible for my election, how can I be held responsible for my damnation? And then Paul goes on at length to say that, I didn't say you were responsible. In fact, you're using the wrong word. You were acting quite foolish and irresponsible. And that's why you are fatally culpable. Remember, there's a very huge distinction between responsible and culpable. Keep that in mind. Different categories entirely. In other words, you did not respond to God in a faithful way, and that is why you are damned, Paul is saying in verse 32. That is why. So the pagan might respond, but my unregenerate will is not even able to be faithful. And actually, in Romans 9:19, the NET version has a really good interpretation of verse 19 here. It says, "For no one has ever resisted God's will," is what the pagans might say. What am I to do? If I can't resist God's will, you can't hold me responsible. No, hold me culpable. But God might respond to that and he'd say, but I created you fully capable. And that's why you are indeed culpable. I created you fully capable. Just as I created Adam fully capable of being faithful. And you are culpable. And so the pagan might respond, but it's not my actual will to be faithful to you. And God would respond, so what's your complaint? Right? So it's a vicious circle. You may think it's a circular logic that's being used here, but it's only vicious coming from the unfaithful pagan. That's all. Now, this vicious charge that's being brought by the pagan is something, well, sometimes by other Christians, it's called double predestination. And people are hostile about, oh no, God is predestinating is causing people to be destined for mercy, and he's also destining others for wrath. There's a double predestination. But that's not a fair charge at all to make against God. Why? Why is it not a fair charge? It's an improper complaint because God predestines some for mercy. People were already predestined for wrath through Adam, remember? We were all predestined for wrath. So there is no symmetrical predestination here as is charged, okay? You can't conflate these categories. And also, God is not bound to provide mercy for all. He's not bound at all to do that. In fact, it's a wonder that he provides any mercy whatsoever. Now, that is the very charge that Paul refutes here in this chapter, and that's the wonder that Paul marvels at as well. That God rightfully claims the right to form the clay however he wishes. He has that right. He claims the right to provide mercy to whomever he wishes. That God is not bound by any external principle beyond him. Any external principle of so-called mercy that we might imagine. Okay? He is only internally bound to himself. Some people are offended by that. I'm not. I'm grateful. Pagans are offended by that God is only bound to himself. But I'm not at all offended by that. They wish that God were bound and nailed to some principle of mercy that they conceive in their own imagination. They wish. They wish that he was bound and nailed to that principle, just like they were bound and nailed to a principle in Adam. Oh, he was, wasn't he? He did bind himself, and he did have himself nailed. Yeah? He did it. He got the white robe out of the deal. Ha ha. And so he is no longer bound. He's resurrected. And we are no longer bound, for we are in him. And now we thank God for his mercy. Thank you.